Hello, peace be with you. I'm going to be reading a chapter from Francois Fenelon today entitled Simplicity. There is a simplicity which is a fault, and there is a simplicity which is a marvelous virtue. Simplicity is often a fault of understanding and is ignorance of the consideration which we owe to each person. When we speak of society of a simple person, we mean a limited, credulous, and coarse mind. The simplicity which is a virtue, far from being coarse, is something sublime. All good men will enjoy it, admire it, feel it when they wound it, notice it in others, and are aware of when they must practice it, but they have trouble saying exactly what this virtue is. One may say of this what the little book, The Imitation of Christ, says of compunction of heart. It is better to practice it than to know how to define it. Simplicity is a rightness of the soul which cuts away all useless turning back upon ourselves and upon our own behavior. It is different from sincerity. Sincerity is a virtue below simplicity. We see lots of people who are sincere without being simple. They say nothing which they do not believe to be true. They only want to seem what they are, but they constantly fear to seem what they are not. They are always studying themselves, going over all their words and all their thoughts, and going back over all that they have done, afraid of having said or done too much. These people are sincere, but they are not yet simple. They are not at ease with others, and others are not at ease with them. We find in them nothing easy, nothing free, nothing ingenuous, nothing natural. We would prefer less regular and more imperfect people who were more natural. That is man's preference, and God's is the same. He wants souls which are not concerned with themselves, as though always making up before the mirror. Always to be interested in creatures without ever making any reflection about oneself, this is the blind state of people whom the present and the material always carries away. It is the opposite extreme to simplicity. Always to be engrossed in self and all that we have to do, whether for creatures or for God, this is the other extreme which makes the soul wise in its own eyes. Always reserved, full of itself, upset by the least things which can trouble its self-complacency. That is false wisdom, which with all its grandeur is hardly less vain or hardly less foolish than the folly of the people who throw themselves head first into every pleasure. The one is intoxicated by all that it sees outside. The other is intoxicated by all that it thinks it is doing within. But in the end, both are intoxicated. Being intoxicated with oneself is even worse than being so with outside things, because it seems like wisdom and is not. We think less of curing ourselves of it. It does us honor. It is approved. We put a force into it which raises us above honors and above the rest of mankind. It is a sickness like a frenzy. We do not feel it. We are at death's door and we say, "I feel well." When we give no thought to ourselves because of being carried away by things outside, we are dizzy. On the contrary, when we turn upon ourselves too much, it is a forced behavior and contrary to simplicity. Simplicity consists of a middle ground in which we are neither giddy nor too composed. The soul is not carried away by the outside world so that it can no longer make the necessary reflections, but it also cuts off the reversions to self, which an uneasy self-love, jealous of its own excellence, multiplies infinitely. This liberty of soul which sees immediately before it as it goes forward, but which loses no time reasoning about its steps, studying them, constantly considering those which it has already made, this is true simplicity. The more docile and yielding a soul is in letting itself be carried away without resistance or delay, the more it advances in simplicity. It is not that it becomes blind to its faults, and that it does not feel its infidelities. It feels them more than ever. It has a horror of these least faults. Its light always grows to discover its corruption. But this knowledge no longer comes through uneasy reversions to self. It is by the light of God's presence that it sees itself against this infinite purity. Thus, against his infinite purity. Thus, it is free in its course because it does not stop to compose itself with skill. This marvelous simplicity is not suitable to the souls which are not yet purified by a thorough penitence, because it can only be the fruit of total detachment from self and of a disinterested love of God. But it succeeds little by little, and although the souls who need penitence to tear themselves away from the vanities of the world ought to make many reflections concerning themselves, nevertheless, I believe that following the openings which grace gives, they must be stopped from falling into a certain excessive preoccupation and anxiety over themselves, which will vex them, trouble them, embarrass them, and always delay them in their course. They are wrapped up in themselves like a traveler who would be wrapped in so many coats, one upon the other, that he could not walk. Too great introversion produces in weak souls a superstition and meticulousness which are harmful, and in souls which are naturally strong, a presumptuous wisdom which is incompatible with the mind of God. All this is contrary to simplicity, which is free, right, and generous, to the point of forgetting itself in order to give itself up to God without reserve. Oh, how happy is the soul which is delivered from its low, self-centered, and worrisome reversions! How noble is its bearing! How great it is! How strong it is! If a man wants his friend to be simple and free with him, so that he will forget himself in this friendly relationship, with how much stronger a reason God, who is the true friend, wants a soul to be without reversion, without anxiety, vexation, without jealousy for itself, without reserve, in the sweet and intimate familiarity which he is preparing for it. It is this simplicity which makes the true perfection of the true children of God. It is the end toward which we should reach and to which we should let ourselves be led. The great obstacle to this happy simplicity is the foolish wisdom of the age, which wants to trust nothing to God, which wants to do everything by its own efforts, to arrange everything for itself, and to admire itself constantly in its works. This wisdom is a folly, according to St. Paul. And the true wisdom, which consists in giving oneself up to the Spirit of God without uneasy reversions to self, is a folly in the mad eyes of the worldly. The soul which has no more self-interest and which is not worrying about itself has only candor. It goes altogether rightly without difficulty. Its way becomes always wider to an unlimited degree as its renunciation and self-forgetfulness augment. Its peace is deep as the sea in the midst of its troubles. But while we still cling to self, we are always upset, unsure, wrapped up in reversions of self-love. Happy is he who is no longer his own. A man full of faults, who does not want to hide any of them, who never tries to fascinate, who never affects talents or virtues or goodwill, who seems to think no more of himself than of others, who seems to have lost the I, of which he is so jealous, and who is like a stranger in regard to himself, he is the man who is infinitely pleasing despite his faults. On the contrary, a man full of talent, of acquired virtues and exterior grace, if he is too self-contained, if he seems always to be attentive to himself, if he affects the best things, is an unpleasant personality, boring, the one who antagonizes everyone. So nothing is better nor greater than to be simple, that is to say, never preoccupied with self. But, we will say, must we never think of self, nor of any of the things which interest us, and never talk about ourselves? No. We must not strain ourselves to this extent. In trying to be simple, We should drive away simplicity by sticking scrupulously to the practice of never talking of self, for fear of being preoccupied with ourselves and saying a few words about ourselves. Then what must we do? Make no rule about it, but be content to affect nothing. When we feel like talking about ourselves through self-interest, we need only to despise this vain impulse, while turning our attention simply either to God or to the things which He wants us to do. Thus, simplicity consists of not having any wrong shame or false modesty, and no more ostentation, vain compliance, or attention to ourselves. When the thought comes through our vanity to speak of self, we need only to drop this foolish reversion to self quickly. When, on the contrary, we think speaking of ourselves for some reason, When, on the contrary, we think of speaking of ourselves for some reason, then we must not debate it too much. We need only to carry out our purpose. But what will they think of me? They will think that I am praising myself foolishly. I shall make myself suspect by speaking freely of my own interest. All these uneasy reflections do not deserve to occupy us for a single moment. Let us talk frankly and simply of ourselves as we should of others. It is thus that St. Paul often speaks of himself in the epistles. Of his birth, he declares that he is a Roman citizen. He makes his rights respected to the point of frightening his judge. He says he has done no less than the greatest of the apostles, that he has not learned any of the doctrine from them, nor received anything from them for the ministry, that he stands as well as they do with Jesus Christ, that he has worked more and suffered more than they, that he has resisted Peter to his face because he was reprehensible, that he had been lifted up to third heaven, that he has nothing to reproach himself for in his conscience, that he is a chosen vessel to bring light to the Gentiles. In fact, he says to the faithful, "Imitate me as I do Jesus Christ." What grandeur there is in speaking thus simply of oneself. St. Paul speaks in the highest praise of himself without appearing either moved or concerned with self. He tells these things as he would tell a story of 2,000 years ago. All should not undertake to say and do the same, but what we are obliged to say of ourselves, we must say simply. To judge of the need which we have to think of ourselves or to speak of ourselves, we must take advice from the person who knows our condition of grace. Thus we will avoid following our own guidance and judging ourselves, which is a source of blessing. Thus it is for the devout and enlightened man from whom we take advice to decide if the need to speak of ourselves is real or imaginary. His examination and his decision will spare us much self-concern. He will also find out if the neighbor to whom we are to speak will not be shocked at this liberty and this simplicity in speaking favorably of ourselves without ceremony in real need. In unexpected cases, in which we have no time to seek advice, we must yield ourselves to God and do according to His light at the time what seems best, but without hesitation, because hesitation would be confusing. First, we must make our decision, then even if we have made a wrong one, wrong will be turned to right by right intention. God will never blame us for what we have done for lack of advice when we are yielding ourselves to the simplicity of His Spirit. This simplicity expands little by little to outer things. As we cut off of all voluntary returns, we act more naturally. Calculation drops with these reflections. We act without thought of ourselves or of our actions by a certain rightness of will which is inexplicable to those who have not experienced it. Then faults turn to good, because they humiliate without discouraging. When God wants to accomplish some outer act through us, either He takes away these faults, or He makes them work for His plans, or He prevents the people who are to be acted upon from being repelled by them. Oh, how amiable this simplicity is! Who will give it to me? I leave all for this. It is the pearl of the gospel.